Oh, yeah, Sherry told me about that last week. Happy Father's Day, everybody. I just wanted to say that. Thank you guys for being here in person or online. We got a good crew of online watchers or listeners or whatever you want to call them with us. So thank you guys all. If you're here in person, stick around because we've got Bunk's Barbecue left over and donated by the Weber family from Fred's Memorial. We got bunks and desserts and lots of great stuff to eat for Father's Day. So stick around and enjoy that with us. All right, you guys know where I've been. I've been in the book of Acts. And Courtney told me I need to knock it off and go on to do something else. So today, yeah, Michelle asked me, she's like, are you still in the book of Acts? And I said, today, last day. So today will be the last day that I'm in the book of Acts. And it's not because I don't love it and I wouldn't spend a couple more months there, but it's time to move on to something else for the summer, so that's okay. But I've been doing the book of Acts for about 2 months now. And we've been hanging out, looking at principles that are lived out and taught through the early New Testament church, right? The book of Acts is basically Luke part 2, and Luke told the story of Jesus, and Luke continues to tell the story of the church in the book of Acts. And so that's where we've been hanging out here for the past 2 months. If you remember, last week I spent some time in chapter 15 mainly, and I looked at the idea of conflict, because even for that New Testament church, the ones that even got to see Jesus face to face, about a year into churchness, and they still have conflict already happening, right? And so the conflict I mainly talked about last week was the Jews and the Gentiles, right? A difference in culture. And the Jews were really, really strong on the tradition they had been raised in of circumcision and being God's person through that way, right? And so what we talked about in Acts 15 last week was they were trying to enforce on the Gentiles that they need to be circumcised to be a child of God, basically, right? But what's crazy about that is the Gentiles have no idea what they're talking about. And if you understand what circumcision is, they probably were like, what? And so Paul and Barnabas, being missionaries for God, tackle this. They work with the church, they work with the shepherds and the elders and the Jews and the Gentiles, and they take a journey and they write a letter and they work through conflict. A couple of the points that I wanted to share out of conflict was that conflict happens, right? This is the brand new church, people who got to meet Jesus, and they still couldn't not have conflict. So conflict happens. Conflict can happen for us today. And I think we all agree with that. If you've been in church for a couple of minutes, you can agree that conflict happens. But the other part is that conflict can be resolved. How can conflict be resolved? Well, conflict happens when we're focused on the wrong thing. The Jews were focused on circumcision rather than faith. What can we do? Well, we can refocus on the right thing. And I said the right thing is the gospel message. It's faith. And that's exactly what Paul and Barnabas helped them refocus on. So conflict happens, but it can be resolved if we refocus. And then we read all of chapter 15, and we saw all the work it took for Paul and Barnabas, and they invested and they put all that work to resolve the conflict. And we get to the end, and I have to laugh. Because Paul and Barnabas, after they solved this big church conflict, can't get along. They get to then 5 verses at the end, and they want to go serve the church and do missionary work and visit the churches they've planted. And Barnabas says, let's bring John Mark. And Paul says, no, I don't like that guy. He left us that one time, you remember? He doesn't say it exactly like that, but Paul says, no, I don't want to bring him along. So Paul takes Silas and goes one way. Barnabas takes John Mark and goes another way. So another solution to conflict can sometimes be taking different paths. And we can see that today in the church as well. Sometimes we might be the same exact church, following the same exact gospel and doing it effectively, but we look slightly different because we're taking slightly different paths, and that's all right sometimes. So that was all about conflict last week in Acts chapter 15. But the reason I gave you such a big recap is this week I want to pick up there right where we left off in the book of Acts, if I can open my Bible there, in the book of Acts, and we ended in chapter 15, and this morning we are going to pick up in chapter 16, verse 1. So if you want to open your Bibles, we'll be in the book of Acts, and we'll be in 16 verse 1, and I want to talk about probably what's the most important thing in all of Acts, and it's this word on the screen. It's conversions. Conversions. Now, that's a really churchy word. For a long time, I really did not like the word conversions, even through Sunset, if you've been in the church, you've been a minister, you like to use this word, but nobody knows what that word means unless you've been in the church, right? Conversion. So I rather like to hang out with the idea of saying someone was saved. Someone is now a follower of Christ. Someone's a Christian, right? Rather than saying they were converted. But conversion's actually not a bad word. I've become more comfortable with it, and it describes exactly what takes place when you become a Christian, doesn't it? You become a Christian, you give your life to God, and actually if you look at even the modern definition, both the definitions fit really well with what happens when you become a Christian. When you're converted or in conversion, this is the process of changing or causing something to change from one form to another. So you can convert electricity from 12 volt to 120, makes sense, right? But also you have number 2, which elaborates to us as people in a religious stance. The fact of changing one's religion or beliefs, or the action of persuading someone to change their beliefs. So conversion, even in our modern English, is actually a great word about being saved, isn't it? The process of changing from being of the world to being of God. Or the process of changing your religion, if you want to use that word. Changing your religion from no religion to God, from this religion to following God in the gospel, however you want to describe it. So conversion, I'm more comfortable with it. I just kind of work you guys with me through that. But that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about conversions in the book of Acts. Basically, people who weren't Christians who are being saved. People who were something else and are now followers of Christ. And so that's really what I think the rest of the book of Acts is actually about. There's 10 chapters from 16 through the end that I'm going to talk about in one sermon. But really, I think if I summed them up, the rest of Acts is all about those people becoming Christians. And that's where we're going to pick up today in Acts chapter 16. And we're going to start in verse 11, actually reading. Before we start reading here, I just want to connect the dots for a minute. We left Paul and Barnabas separate. Paul takes Silas. Barnabas takes John Mark. Who we're following here in Acts 16 is Paul. Paul and Silas. And actually, they pick up another brother to work with them. His name is Timothy. Not yet? Okay, Terry was looking at me. I could have been wrong. They pick up another brother called Timothy, and he's along with them as well. And so what are they doing? Well, they're continuing the work. They're going to visit the churches. They're continuing to share the gospel message. They're still doing missionary work, if you will. And that's where we're at, where we pick up with them in verse 11. So it's Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and they're doing great ministry work. And kind of at the end, like in verses 9 and 10 before where we pick up, Paul is told by God to go to a certain region. He's told to go to Macedonia. And so, verse 11, we pick up with the journey to Macedonia. So if you would, grab your Bibles. Let's read here verses 11 through 15 of Acts chapter 16. So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, or something like that, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days, and on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and we spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after, she was baptized, and her household was as well. She urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house to stay." And she prevailed upon us. All right, just a few verses after we left off last week. We're following Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and we start off with they're on a road trip, right? More than a road trip. A trip. And where are they going? They're going to Macedonia. Specifically, they end up in Philippi. Philippi, the center, the capital of Macedonia. And they get there, and we see that when they get there, they're looking for the people who might be praying, right? It says they got to the city, and they supposed there would be a place of prayer by the riverside outside of the city. So that's where they go. They go there to that place, and they find who? They find the women. They find women there praying. I don't know if it had to do with the certain time of day they went or whatever that might be, but they found the women gathered together, and they got this opportunity to talk to this specific woman named Lydia, right? And what do we know about Lydia? Well, Lydia was from a different city, and she was a seller of purple linens, and she already believed in God. She was a worshiper of God. And she listened to Paul, heard what he had to say, was baptized, and so was her family. The story of Lydia. The conversion of Lydia, if you want to use that word. One conversion in the book of Acts. What about another? I'm going to speed run us through 3 different conversions this morning. We don't have to wait very long because Lydia, her story ends for the time being at least in 15 of chapter 16. And verse 25, we read of another conversion story. And if you've never seen this little icon on a scripture before, it just simply means "and following." So this is 25 through the end of the chapter. Instead of typing out all those numbers, just put 2 little F's. It's easier. So Acts chapter 16, 25 and following, we have the story of the jailer. Read with me here. About midnight, let me fill you in for a second. Paul and Barnabas have been thrown in jail for sharing the gospel. Typical Paul and Barnabas. Okay, that's pretty much all you need to know. About midnight, Paul and Barnabas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them because they're in prison. And suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's bonds or chains were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that everyone had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Don't harm yourself, we are here." And the jailer called for the lights and rushed in. And trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all who were in his house. And he took him at the same hour of the night and washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and his family. Then he brought them up to his house, and he set food before them, and he rejoiced along with his entire household that they believed in God. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let these men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and then they threw us into prison. And now they want to let us go secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported this to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and they visited Lydia, remember her? And they had seen the brothers and they encouraged them and they departed. So speed run through the second conversion that we're going to talk about today. Who's this guy? Well, he's a jailer, Philippian jailer, if you will. It's in the city of Philippi. They haven't left. Lydia preached in the public forum, got thrown into prison. Now we're at the jailer. What happens in this story? Well, they're in jail. They are praising God with the other inmates all around them. And something crazy happens. There's an earthquake. It breaks everything. The chains fall off. It's not a normal earthquake, obviously, right? And the jailer, having woke up to this, knows that if an earthquake has broken everyone's chains and opened the doors, they're gone. But they're not gone. They're not gone. Paul and Silas, they're in prison, are still there. They say, don't fear, we're still here. And the jailer was ready to kill himself. You ever notice that part of the story? He was ready to kill himself. Why do you think he was ready to kill himself? Well, because he knew if in the morning there were no prisoners, it would be better if he was dead than tortured than dead, right? But look, they're all still there. And he asks Paul and Barnabas, what should I do to be saved? And they tell him, and that very night he and his household are saved. And Paul and Silas, I keep doing that. Paul and Silas get to have a meal with him and share the gospel with him. And then we see they do finally get released, even though it's a little interesting. The second story of conversion in chapter 16. Let me read you one more. You read along with me. In Acts chapter 18, verse 24. So we're going to jump a couple of chapters here to chapter 18. And if you want to fill in the blanks, if you haven't been reading Acts, Paul and Silas keep doing the work. Paul and Silas keep working on the missionary journey. They keep traveling. And we end up in chapter 18, verse 24, with this man named Apollos in the city of Ephesus. Read with me starting in verse 24 through the end of the chapter. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord and been fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately the things that concerning Jesus, but he only knew the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who had grace and helped them believe. For he had powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that Christ was Jesus. Now you might be thinking, I jumped 2 chapters, so what's happening in the story? Who's this Apollos guy? Well, we don't know anything about this Apollos guy before we read about him here in Acts 18:24. But we do know about 2 other people that are mentioned in his story. Priscilla and Aquila. They come up a little bit earlier in chapter 18, and basically, when Paul and Silas get to Corinth, they meet this brother and sister in Christ. Priscilla and Aquila, they are husband and wife, and they are serving the church in Corinth. So, Paul and Silas obviously are great friends, brothers and sisters with them, right? So this next conversion doesn't necessarily take place through Paul and Silas, but rather Priscilla and Aquila. And it's this guy named Apollos. What do we see about Apollos when we read his story? Well, we see that he was a native of Alexandria, but now he's here in Ephesus. And what's he doing? Well, he's preaching. He's proclaiming the Scriptures and proclaiming God, right? And he's doing a good job. He knows about Jesus. He's proclaiming the story of Jesus. But he's missing one thing. One thing that Priscilla and Aquila can tell him about to really convert him. And it's important. He only teaches the baptism of John. So what does that mean? Well, it means he didn't realize that when you're baptized, you can be saved. He had the whole story of Jesus. He had the teachings of God, and he knew the Scriptures fervently, but he still missed something. Again, this is new to him. This is new to everybody, that the baptism of Jesus is different than the baptism of John. So they teach him more perfectly. They teach him salvation through baptism. And what's he keep doing? He keeps preaching. But now he knows even better. So I guess you could call this one a conversion, or you can call it a correction, or you could call it a polishing, if you will, of Apollos. But those are the 3 conversions that I want to talk about this morning. Acts chapter 16, 11 through 15, the conversion of the lady named Lydia. Acts 16, 25 and following, the conversion of the jailer in Philippi with Paul and Silas. Acts 18:24, the conversion of this preacher guy named Apollos, and what Priscilla and Aquila could teach him a little more better, a little more perfectly. A little more better is not proper grammar. People are going to be mad at me for that. So, in these three conversions, what are some details that we can kind of pull out of these? That's kind of what I thought when I read them. Who are these people? Why are they converted? Why do they want to become Christians or better Christians or whatever? What is actually happening? What are the requirements to be converted? Because there's got to be requirements, right? What are conversion requirements? These three stories, if we took them apart, what's all the same? Well, when I tried to do that, I kind of came up with the opposite, actually. I came up with what's not a conversion requirement, and that's what I want to talk about today. What's not a conversion requirement when we look at Lydia, the jailer, and Apollos? The very first one I noticed, what's not a requirement to be converted to Christ? Your nationality. Paul and Barnabas kind of had to deal with nationality when it came to Jews and Gentiles. But here we see it yet again. We see the regions, and it's written down for us, the regions where these different people come from. Lydia was from the city of Thyatira, however you say it, right? So Lydia is from there. The jailer, he's from Philippi. And then we have a Jew in Ephesus. Three different backgrounds when it comes to location and nationality. Interesting. So in order to become a follower of Jesus, to be saved, to be converted, you don't have to be a certain nationality. This is mind-blowing to the Jews. To us today, we say absolutely. But this is mind-blowing to the Jews. So for us today as well, who's exempt based on their nationality, their skin color, their background, where they grew up? Nobody. Everybody can be converted. Everybody can be saved. So that's not a requirement. What else isn't a requirement? Gender. This is also pretty important. The very first one we read about in 16 was a lady. And we don't read about her husband. We know she has a family, but we just read about Lydia. And Paul and Silas go to Lydia as she's praying by the river. They talk to her, they preach to her, they share to her, and through her, her whole family is saved. And she was a woman. But yet, the jailer and Apollos, they were men in various different roles. So, I guess it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. Same for us today. You can become a Christian if you're a woman or a man. Gender doesn't matter. It's not a requirement. What else is not a requirement? What you do for work, your profession. It's interesting that we read about what they do for work, for the most part, in all three of these stories. For Lydia, she was a seller of fine linens or purple goods, depending on your translation. What does that mean? Because today we'd be like, Walmart's a seller of linens and purple goods, right? Money, money, money. She sold the Gucci of the time, right? This was the best and the most royal, literally, purple means royalty, of linens and clothing you could wear. So if you deal in high-end goods, what is to be assumed about you? You're kind of a little high-end yourself, right? At the very least, you're making good money doing it because you got a lot of money invested in the business. So she's selling high-end goods, she's making good money, and she's a woman. Wow, she's a weird one. Then we have the normal everyday guy, the jailer. He's got a good, solid job, providing for his family, working in Philippi. He's just a normal guy, a jailer. And he probably had a standard job with a standard amount of money and a standard family. But Lydia was rich. Interesting. And then we get to Apollos. And this one's kind of funny to me because Apollos was already a preacher, in the way I read it. Lydia sold purple, there was a jailer, and the last conversion was of a preacher. So what does it not require to become a Christian? Not a certain job, that's for sure. It doesn't matter if you make a lot of money, you work a lot, you make a little money, you work a little, or mix those up, whatever. It doesn't matter if you are rich and sell rich things, or if you are already a preacher. That one kind of blows my mind. You can learn more about God and be brought to the gospel message even if you're already a preacher or even if you sell Gucci. Interesting. What else is not a requirement? I put this one kind of carefully, but the mental state of these people is not a requirement. And sometimes we can get caught on this one. I think we can get caught on the other three so far too, but don't you got to be in a good mental state to go to church and become a Christian? No. Lydia was in a good place. She was at the river praying. She was probably in a pretty good mental state. Depends what she was praying for, though, I guess. But you know who wasn't in a good mental state? The guy who was about to commit suicide a minute before he was saved. I don't think that's a great mental state to be in. But yet, even though he was about to kill himself, Paul and Silas still shared the gospel with him when he asked, "What can I do to be saved?" So, I guess it doesn't matter if you're going to be in a mental state the day before of, should I kill myself? God can still share you the gospel through some people. So, not a requirement. Your mental state is not a requirement. And then also Apollos, I don't know exactly what his mental state was, but I think he thought he had it together. Most of us preachers do. But he didn't, did he? He didn't have it together. He had more to learn and more to be taught. So his mental state was maybe a little proud. The jailer's was too far down, and I don't know where Lydia's was, but all three of them, different places, God wanted them all to be converted. What else is not a requirement? Education. Lydia, like we said about her job, obviously she's very well educated in these fine linens. The Philippian jailer, he knows his job well, but he probably doesn't have to be any higher educated. And then we come to Apollos, who is preaching in the public forum the gospel and all the scriptures. So he's well studied, if you will. I mean, we don't necessarily have to have an education equivalent for that, but he's got a master's in the scriptures. And so they come from various different backgrounds there as well. Education different, but it wasn't a requirement. And their religious backgrounds weren't a requirement either. Lydia, she believed in God. And yet she could still be saved, even from believing. The jailer, as far as I read it, he didn't have any belief or know anything about God per se. Yet he was still saved. And he asked, "What should I do to be saved?" And then on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, Apollos knew everything. I think he thought that. Apollos knew everything about the scriptures, but he was still missing a piece. So he really believed in God. He really believed in Jesus. Lydia knew about God, and the jailer had no idea what they were talking about. But yet, all three of them could be saved. All three of them could be converted. So that's not a requirement either. You know what else isn't the requirement? The location. Paul and Silas go to Lydia. Where's she at? Next to the river. They save her there. Paul and Silas are in jail. It gets destroyed. Dark, dingy dungeon. The jailer gets saved there. And then we have Apollos, who's in the synagogue, the public forum of teaching. And he can be taught more perfectly and saved there. Location is not a requirement. And you don't have to have a preacher. I kind of glossed over Priscilla and Aquila earlier because when we talk about Lydia, we have two missionaries. Of course they save her, right? Paul and Silas. We have the jailer. Paul and Silas are still there. Of course they save him. But we come to Apollos, who's a preacher already, and you know who saved him? Two normal Christians, Priscilla and Aquila. Two faithful Christians who were not given the title of elder or preacher or pastor or any of those, but instead we're given the title of faithful servants. And they saved, or taught more perfectly, Apollos. So, I just put down in my notes that a conversion requirement is that there's no preacher necessary, but instead there's the gospel message necessary. I just want to quickly apply these to us today because in the early church, these conversion requirements were not required at all. Today, no nationality is going to hinder you from becoming a Christian. Do we believe that? Yeah? Okay. No gender is going to hinder you from becoming a Christian. Absolutely. No profession or income status is going to hinder you from becoming a Christian or make you become a Christian. Right? And there's other churches that wouldn't say that, but that's true. You can be rich or poor or busy or not, working, it doesn't matter. The mental state's a huge one. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. You can still hear about Jesus and be saved. Your education doesn't matter. You can have a doctorate, college, high school, or dropped out of third grade, and you can still hear the gospel message and be saved. You could be Mormon or Catholic or Satanist before, and you can still be saved. Your religious background doesn't matter. I just picked 3 random ones. It really doesn't matter. And you don't have to come to the church building to be saved. This can happen at the riverside, in the jail, or at the college, or anywhere else in between. And I don't need to be there because you guys might be there. The gospel message might be there. Conversion requirements really aren't requirements at all. And kind of thank God for that, right? And I thank God that He gave us these 3 examples in the book of Acts. And all 3 of these people were saved. Lydia opened her heart to what Paul was preaching and heard the gospel message. And you know who else was saved in the Lydia story? In 16? Her whole family, her whole household. That's pretty impressive. Her whole household now got to hear the gospel and be saved because she bumped into these guys at the river. That's awesome. What about the jailer? He was saved. He asked, "What must I do to be saved?" And he was baptized, just like Lydia. Who else was baptized? Who else was saved? His whole household as well. In fact, he brought Paul and Silas back home. They were prisoners, by the way, so that's interesting. But he took them back home, fed them a good meal, and they shared the gospel with the whole family, and they were all saved. More conversions. And then what about Apollos? Did you notice what he did after he was taught a little more perfectly? Was he grumpy that he was not as smart of a preacher as he thought he was? Well, maybe. We didn't read it. What we read is he heard it. He heard the good news, the rest of the story, that you could be saved through the baptism of Christ, and he went and preached it. He kept on going strong. So who knows how many people are saved through Apollos? In fact, he's referenced a couple more times throughout the New Testament as we continue reading. So he kept at it. He kept on with more conversions for other people. So these 3 stories about people becoming Christians in the book of Acts are actually how many stories of people becoming Christians? I can't even count them. We don't know the number. Household, and continue to be a preacher for the gospel message. So I know I kind of just ran through 3 stories, 3 conversions, if you will, for my last sermon in Acts. But I really think this is kind of what Acts is all about. If Acts is the story of the church, it also is the story of conversions. It's also the story of people being saved. More people and more people and more people. And I hope what you hear when you read these stories is that conversions can be incredible. But they don't have to fit the mold that we sometimes put them in. They don't need a location, an education, or a preacher. They don't need money. They don't need a gender. They don't need a nationality. But instead, they need the gospel message to be delivered. So, the book of Acts ends here in 10 chapters, chapter 28. So I stopped in verse 8 or chapter 18, but there's still 10 more chapters there. What keeps happening in the next 10 chapters? The same incredible stuff. People are reached, missionary journeys are taken, more conversions happen, and the church continues to grow. The Gentiles are taught the gospel. The Jews are continued to be taught the gospel. And Paul preaches till the end of chapter 28. We follow along Paul for a long time. But Paul preaches and teaches all the way through chapter 8, and it's all about converting people to be followers of Christ. So if that's what the rest of the book of Acts is about, is it really over at chapter 28? Or does it live on in chapter 29? I want you guys to be the ones who make it live on in chapter 29. I want me to be the one that makes it live on in chapter 29. Because if Acts is all about converting people to the gospel and bringing them to Jesus Christ, it's not over yet. It's just getting started, and it's all about conversions. Thank you, guys.